Hello! In this video I will be discussing corset mock-ups. By this time you should have watched previous videos and learned how to get your pattern ready for this corset. I have an update for the pattern. I decided to put the pattern on both sides so when you do your mock-up it would be easier to have both sides traced out. So the way you can do that is to have your side up that we already made. You put a piece of chalk paper underneath and then you just trace the lines you already made, and then you can go over those little dots with a pencil. So I decided to label each side as well, and this one for the pattern I showed you, that will end up being the left side of your corset. So first thing you need to do for your mock-up is to get your fabric that you will be using to make it, and I'm using cotton twill. For each side of the corset you're going to pick which pattern piece you're going to have. You can weight it down. I have these big washers I bought from a hardware store. You want to make sure that the corset is lined up on the grain. Here's the selvage edge, so you want to be parallel to that. And because this already has seam allowances, you can easily cut it out. I have a self-healing mat and a rotary cutter, so I can easily cut out my pattern piece. So now you have all of your pattern pieces cut out, and I just want to make a note to make sure you keep your pattern piece with the cutout fabric piece. Just leave it on top until it's in use. That way you won't get the pattern piece mixed up, turned around, upside down, because you don't need to really label them. We're just going to use them one by one. And also, I want to make a note for the grommet panel. Remember to cut on the fold. I sometimes forget, but that is important. And also, I'm going to show you how to add the seam allowance lines, your sewing lines. So for the sake of this mock-up, I'm going to do an easier method of using chalk paper. So you can take the chalk paper, you just put it over the pattern, line up the pattern. Easier way, you can turn chalk paper around, turn the pattern piece over, and then use the other side to trace it so you can actually see where the pattern piece is. Just label the lines, label the waist, and then move on to the next one. You can also use this other method that you will probably need to use when you actually use the mesh, which is painter's tape. I saw this idea online. Because the fabric I have chosen to use, this mesh, doesn't allow chalk or pens or anything to actually label where the seam allowances are, I'm going to have to use tape. So if you can imagine, this is a piece of the mesh. I'm going to turn it back the way it was here. And you can't get a single seam allowance line on here. You can take your seam guide, since this is already the seam allowance length. We made that 1.5 inches for the seam allowance. You can take that and you can use that as a guide to take your painter's tape and actually tape where the line is going to be. Now you want to put the tape so that is on the inside of the line, so when you sew you will actually be following just next to the line. This method I tried on a different panel already and it worked really well. Okay, so now you should have all of your pattern pieces marked with the chalk, and I went over the tracing paper chalk mark lines with a chalk pencil so it would show up better for the camera and not rub away as easily when I'm doing this. So I'm working on the right side of the corset, also the loop side. And there's an important sequence to get down when you are making this mesh corset. If you read Sydney Eileen's tutorial on this already, I thought it seemed obvious at first when I was reading it, but I actually found it quite difficult to understand how to get to the next panel and then the next panel after that. So I found a method that works really well. So I'm starting with the bust panel side, which will be attaching to the mesh piece 1. And you have your chalk lines up, and what you do is you line up the right seam line with the right seam line, and the bust panel piece goes underneath this piece, and you will put your pins in by lining up. You make sure to keep pinning and checking that your lines match up, and when we get it all pinned up, I will show you what to do next. Here is the seam I just sewed. I'm using a bright color thread so you can see it easily. For this tutorial, Sydney Eileen shows a lot of different directional sewings. Usually for corsets you want to start at the top and sew down for each panel, but for the sake of this tutorial I'm going to follow it the way that she does it. So to try not to be complicated, I'm going to try to do enough steps so you can get the pattern down, and once you get the pattern down it's pretty easy to do. So this is the top. We're going to flip the corset around. I know this is hard to see because I'm using black on black, but this seam allowance is important. What you want to do is to fold what would be our mesh over so that it is right folded onto the seam allowance line here, not squishing the seam allowance in any way. Keep it tight to the seam allowance like this, so you can just kind of feel it, and then you fold it over one more time, and you do not want to fold it too shallow, you don't want to fold it too much. This is important. So you want to fold it so that it's close to the original seam line but does not go over the seam line. You don't want to fold it too thin like this, and that will be important in the next step. So I'll just refold this here. Then you fold it again. So it's about 1/4 of an inch. And then you do that for the whole way down. You don't need to pin it. It would just be easier just to sew it like this. So I'm just going to sew close to this folded edge. Alright, here is the seam I just sewed the same way up that I just showed you previously. As you can see from this side, I stayed within the original seam allowance line, so that is important. So it was about 1/4 of an inch that I folded it. So now you will open this up and fold this towards the bust panel. And I'm going to flip this around once again. And so now this is the top, and you just keep pushing it towards the bust panel, and you just want to hold it taut. So you fold this over, hold it taut so that there's no bunches of fabric under here, and you're just going to sew this down. Once again, basically edge stitch this down. Okay, so here is the line I just sewed. It's the one closest to my thumb. And as you can see, the mesh panel, the side up we had originally, is now the inside of the corset. This side that we just did is the lining side. So everything you see sewn here will be seen from the inside. So the next piece we need is the double boning channel. Now we're still going to follow this step of keeping the seam lines facing up, and never mind about this one anymore. We're always going to follow that the mesh panel seam lines will be up, and you will follow for this side. Now it's the left to left. So we're gonna end up sewing the seam lines of both left sides here. So just like the other side, but now it's left to left. Okay, here it is all pinned. I actually pinned it upside down because I found it easier just to keep the consistency of having, you know, the right seam on the right when it's actually the left on the left. So I'm gonna sew it upside down this way, and then we're gonna do exactly what we just did for the last seam. So here's a seam I just sewed upside down. We're gonna flip it again and do the exact same thing where we have the seam allowance here. We fold it over, being careful to line it with the seam allowance line, and then we're gonna fold it over 1/4 of an inch again, and sew edge stitch that all the way down. Okay, here is the seam I just sewed on the same side I just sewed it on. Once again, you flip it over, you pull out the now seam allowance, or not the seam allowance, excuse me, the boning channel panel, and push this down towards the boning channel panel. And then sew that again, edge stitch it. Alright, so here is the seam line I just sewed, and I'm going to flip this back the right way. So I misspoke earlier about labeling or which side was going to be the inside. The side with the fold is actually going to be the interior of the corset, not the lining interior, but the part where it's going to have be sandwiched. So this is the side that's going to be the lining. So I've labeled the interior with a mesh 1, so I know which mesh panel this is supposed to be. So now that that's out of the way, we're going to move on to mesh number 2. So this is already labeled, or with the seam allowance lines. So since we always follow what the seam allowance lines are on the mesh, we're going to look for the seam allowance lines on here. So here are some seam allowance lines. So this is the busk panel. I should probably label that one too before I get confused. But I know this is the next panel I want to use because this is the really long boning channel pattern. So the only line available right here is the right line. So this is the left line, this is the right line. We're going to match up the two right lines. We're going to pin that and sew it down. So I just did all the steps without showing on the camera, and this is now the inside, and this is the lining side. So this you will see when you have the corset on. And this is where the two flaps are. They're right next to each other. So the reason it was important to stay, to make the flaps, I guess you could call them, not too skinny is because if they were skinnier, they would actually be overlapping on the inside here. So if you make them about 1/4 of an inch, they will just fit. Later on, you will be making a boning channel cover using the exact same panel that you did for this. So all you have to do is keep following the steps. So next you will put another boning channel panel on this side, and you'll use both left seam allowances, and then you will just keep going from there, and then I will show you what to do after you get that far.